I paid for my own birthday dinner while my family passed my negative bank balance around the table like a joke. And before dessert hit the plates, my father stood up, raised a glass, and called me the biggest disappointment in the room. They all laughed. Then they let me pay the bill. They picked the restaurant after I offered to cover dinner. It was one of those chain Italian places in a shopping centre that tries hard to feel nicer than it is. Dim lights, fake brick, waiters balancing trays of pasta and wine, like the room mattered more than the food. It still cost enough that I felt it before I even sat down. I remember smoothing my dress under the table and telling myself not to be tense, not to expect anything, because every year I made the same mistake of hoping my family could act normal for 2 hours if the occasion was technically about me. That lasted maybe 5 minutes. My mother, Elaine, asked how the calls were going at work, and before I could answer, she waved her hand and told everyone that when people at church asked what I did, she just said I worked in healthcare administration, because saying I spent all day dealing with billing disputes sounded depressing. My father, Richard, didn't even let the moment breathe before he brought up one of my cousins closing on her third condo down south. He looked right at me when he said she was 28 and already building something real, then added that it must be nice not to still be renting a basement room from a stranger at my age. My brother Jason laughed into his drink and said at least I didn't have to worry about maintaining a whole house, since I couldn't even keep a savings account alive. Then Kelsey reached across the breadbasket and took my phone right off the table. She did it so casually it took me a second to even react. She tapped open my banking app because she knew the passcode, held the screen up, and announced to the whole table that I was sitting at negative $52 in checking on my own birthday. She laughed first, then everyone else did. My Aunt Paula compared me to some neighbour's son with a hybrid and a townhouse. Jason shook his fork at me and said teachers used to call me gifted, and now I was just this. I sat there with my hands in my lap, smiling that tight smile people use when they're trying not to give strangers a show, while a couple at the next table kept pretending not to listen. The worst part wasn't even the individual comments. It was how natural it all felt to them. Nobody was testing the line. Nobody was wondering if they'd gone too far. They were relaxed, comfortable. They were speaking the way people do when they've spent years saying the same ugly things and getting away with it. When my father finally stood with his wine glass over the table, I already knew it was going to land badly. I could feel it in my stomach before he opened his mouth. He cleared his throat, looked everywhere except at me, and said, "To our biggest disappointment, may she at least find somebody rich enough to keep her from moving back home." The table erupted. My mother clinked her glass. Jason laughed so hard he leaned back in his chair. Kelsey shoved my shoulder and told me not to be so sensitive, that it was just family honesty. Then my mother, still smiling down at her plate, mentioned that she and my father had updated their will and decided the money should go to the kids who knew what to do with it. Natalie would just waste it on rent and grocery delivery, she said, like she was talking about the weather. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I asked the server for the check. When the black folder hit the table, my father did that little pocket pat like maybe he might reach for his wallet, then let his hand drop and said, "You got this, right, birthday girl?" The total came to a little over $400 with tax and tip. My card only went through because it was credit, not the checking account they had just mocked in public. Outside in the parking lot, everybody suddenly switched back into their normal voices. My mother hugged me and told me she'd see me for Christmas. Jason slapped my shoulder. Kelsey asked if I wanted the group photo she'd taken right after the toast. Nobody apologised. Nobody even checked my face. I drove back to the basement studio I rented from Daniel Brooks. parked in the dark, and sat in my car until the windows fogged. I kept hearing that word, disappointment, like my father had just given me my official title in front of witnesses. When I finally went inside, I opened my laptop and pulled up 3 accounts that had quietly ruled my life for years. Then I made 3 phone calls. One to a mortgage company in another state, one to an auto lender, and one to Daniel upstairs. By the time I went to bed, nothing had changed for them yet. They were probably still laughing about dinner. They had no idea that the daughter they treated like a punchline had just cut the wires holding half their life in place. The part nobody at that table understood was that the negative balance on my phone wasn't proof I was lazy or childish or bad with money. It was proof that I had been keeping them afloat so long they'd forgotten what drowning looked like. If anyone had bothered to pull up my statements for the last 6 years instead of just laughing at one bad number, they would have seen a pattern so obvious it almost made me sick. Every month, between $800 and $1,200 left my paycheck and went straight into their lives. My job didn't pay badly for where I lived. I worked in medical billing, handled dispute calls, fixed claim issues, chased coding errors, and kept my voice steady while strangers yelled at me about things I didn't personally break. It brought in around $43,000 a year, which wasn't glamorous, but it should have been enough for one person living carefully. The reason it never felt like enough was because I was never really living on one income. I was living on what was left after my family took their cut. It started when my father's remodeling business slowed down. He called me one night, sounding embarrassed, said they were short on the mortgage just for a little while, and asked if I could help until more jobs came through. My parents' house was a 3-bedroom place in the suburbs, with a payment close to $3,000 a month, way more house than they should have been carrying by then. But they loved the image of it. My mother's part-time job at a dental office covered groceries and utilities on a good month, but that was it. So I set up an automatic payment to their mortgage company and told myself it was temporary. Temporary turned into routine so slowly I almost didn't notice. Then Jason wanted a new SUV because his sales job required him to look successful, or that was how he framed it, and his credit wasn't clean enough to qualify without help. He came to me with that younger brother charm he only uses when he wants something, promised I'd never actually have to make a payment, and swore co-signing was just a formality. 3 separate times in 2 years, I got the call that he was behind and needed me to cover just this one until his commission hit, and every time I paid it, because the alternative was letting the loan go delinquent with my name attached. The uglier part was that my mother insisted none of this should ever be discussed openly. She said telling Jason or Kelsey the truth would only cause resentment and drama, as if secrecy was somehow the more mature option. So they got to keep their version of me, the sad little renter in a basement, the one who never quite figured life out, while my money quietly made sure our parents kept the house and Jason kept the shiny car they all bragged about. I was useful as long as I stayed invisible. After the dinner, I went silent. I didn't answer my mother's texts about Christmas plans, and I let my father's missed calls stack up without listening to the voicemails where he tried to act like they were only joking. Kelsey sent me the photo from the restaurant anyway, the one she took right after the toast, and then another screenshot with my negative balance circled in red like it was some kind of family meme. My thumb hovered over the keyboard more than once, but I didn't give them the fight they were expecting. At work, I kept my headset on, processed claims, and let my phone vibrate itself tired in my desk drawer. 10 days after my birthday, my mother sent a long message about how she was worried I was being distant and how healthy families didn't let misunderstandings drag on. She didn't mention the toast. She didn't mention the will. She definitely didn't mention the fact that they had all watched me pay for my own humiliation and then gone home feeling fine. 15 days after dinner, my father left a voicemail saying they needed to talk about something important with the house, and even then he still couldn't bring himself to say the word sorry. By the 20th day, the messages had turned frantic. I sat on my lunch break and counted them, texts, voicemails, emails, DMs, and ended up at a number so ridiculous I laughed out loud in my car. 148 messages from my parents, Jason, Kelsey, my aunt, my cousin, all asking what I'd done, demanding I stop ignoring them, warning me not to make this worse. They were spiraling, and underneath all that noise was one truth none of them had fully named yet. The reason their lives were suddenly wobbling had nothing to do with a birthday dinner or hurt feelings. It was because the daughter they called a disappointment had stopped quietly paying the bill. The first real crack showed up on the 1st of the month, and it arrived exactly the way consequences usually do for people who think someone else will catch them. Quietly at first, then all at once. The automatic mortgage payment I'd been sending to my parents' lender for 6 straight years didn't go through, because I had cancelled it that night after dinner. Instead of my account stepping in the way it always had, the bank tried to pull the full amount from my father's checking, found almost nothing there, pushed it negative, and generated the kind of warning letter people pretend they never got until the second one comes in red. My mother started texting me before 9 that morning. At first, she acted confused, like there had been some little clerical mix-up. She asked whether I'd changed banks, whether the lender had done something strange, whether I could call and straighten it out since I had always been so good with that stuff. By noon, confusion had turned into irritation. My father left a voicemail blaming the mortgage company for playing games and saying somebody needed to fix it before they started adding nonsense fees. Listening to him talk, you would have thought a random storm had blown through their finances instead of the actual person who'd been subsidising them finally stepping back. The ridiculous part was that I remembered every detail of that call to the lender. I was sitting in my parked car outside the restaurant with my uneaten entree boxed up beside me, listening to hold music while a representative confirmed my name, the account number, and the fact that I was the one making payments on a house I didn't own. She sounded politely surprised when I asked her to remove my card and cancel the draft altogether. Then she reminded me, in that careful customer service tone, that unless another payment method was added, the next due date would be missed. I told her I understood. A week later, my father was waiting for me outside my office when my shift ended. It was already dark, and his truck was parked crooked across 2 spots, like urgency excused bad manners. He stepped in front of my car before I could pull out and motioned for me to roll down the window. I lowered it just enough to hear him, not enough to invite him in. He leaned down and asked why the mortgage company was saying the automatic payment had been cancelled, and the look on his face told me he still believed this was some misunderstanding I would solve if he pushed hard enough. I reminded him that I was the one who had set it up, and I was the one who could stop it. He blinked at me like the sentence was in another language. Then he said, "You can't just do that. We were counting on you." I asked him if he remembered standing over my birthday cake with a wine glass in his hand and calling me the family's biggest disappointment. He looked away for half a second, then muttered that he was just trying to give me a push. I put the car in reverse and told him the bank had given him one too. He was still shouting my name when I backed out and left him standing there in the lot. That same night, Jason finally figured out his problem wasn't separate from theirs. He called already yelling, demanding to know whether I had stopped covering his car payments. For the last 2 years, every time he fell behind, I'd quietly gone online and caught the account up before it rolled into real trouble. On my call with the auto lender after the dinner, I hadn't just asked what happened if I stopped. I told them I would no longer authorize any charges tied to me beyond what I was legally obligated to face as co-signer. The woman explained, very plainly, that if the primary borrower stayed delinquent, the account would proceed the way delinquent car notes always do, and both our credit would take the hit. Jason called that selfish. He said I was ruining both of us to prove some weird point. I asked him if he remembered laughing when Kelsey held up my bank balance at dinner, and if he remembered clinking his glass when Dad toasted to me being a disappointment. He said they were joking, and that family had always messed with each other like that. I told him that from now on, he was going to find out what adulthood felt like, without me padding the floor beneath him. Then I hung up. 2 days later, I got to work early and saw a tow truck through the lobby glass, backing toward the visitor lot. Jason had parked his SUV there, apparently planning to corner me before my shift and force some kind of conversation. Instead, I stood inside with my badge in my hand and watched the driver hook the truck up while Jason paced in a dress shirt with his phone pressed to his ear. A couple of people from nearby offices had already slowed down to watch. He spotted me through the glass, pointed, and started shouting that this was my fault, but security had already been briefed that my family might start showing up. One of the guards stepped between us before I even reached the door. I flashed my badge, walked past the whole scene without stopping, and sat down at my desk with my pulse hammering in my throat. For the first time since I'd signed my name next to Jason's, the consequences of his choices were landing where they belonged. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. I felt awake. A week after the tow truck hauled Jason's SUV away, my basement studio stopped feeling like a cheap place to sleep and started feeling like a trap with a mailing address. It kept me close enough for surprise visits, parking lot scenes, and the kind of family drama that could reach my door before I had time to decide whether I wanted to deal with it. Every time I pulled into that driveway after work, I caught myself checking the street first, wondering whose car might be waiting there and what fresh crisis they were ready to dump in my lap. So I went upstairs and knocked on Daniel Brooks's door. He answered in socks and a school sweatshirt, still grading papers at his kitchen table. And when I told him I needed to move out by the middle of the next month, he didn't ask for my whole life story. He just nodded, said he was sorry if things were rough, and asked me to give him a firm date so he could start looking for the next tenant. That simple professionalism nearly undid me. I was so used to every boundary becoming a debate that his basic respect felt strange. That night, I booked 3 weeks at an extended stay hotel across town, using money from an online savings account my family didn't know existed. I'd built it slowly over 3 years, a little here, a little there, while living cheap and pretending not to notice how humiliating it was to be someone's emergency fund and still feel one missed shift away from disaster myself. By the time I packed, I realised everything I owned fit in the back of my car. 2 suitcases, a few plastic bins, some work clothes, a thrift store bookshelf I ended up leaving behind. It was depressing in one way and freeing in another. I didn't have much, but every piece of it was mine. My mother figured out I'd moved because she drove over to Daniel's place to confront me about the mortgage late fees and found a locked basement and somebody else's car in the driveway. Daniel texted me afterward to say a woman claiming to be my mother had shown up asking where I went, whether he had my new number, and if she could just take a quick look downstairs. He told her no because I was a former tenant and that was private, not because he was protecting me specifically, just because he understood basic decency. My mother responded the way people like her always do when they hit a closed door. She started texting me that I was cold, selfish, ungrateful, and childish. or because I'd done something as outrageous as move without submitting the decision for family approval. Kelsey caught me in person a few days later at a grocery store near my office. I had a carton of eggs in one hand and coffee in the other when I heard my name and turned to see her pushing a basket with that determined look she gets when she thinks she's about to force a breakthrough. She blocked my cart, told me Mum wasn't sleeping, said Dad looked sick, and added in this hushed, shaky voice that they might actually lose the house. I asked her if she still had the photo she took of my bank balance at my birthday dinner. Her face changed instantly. Then I pulled up my transaction history and held the screen where only she could see it. Line after line of transfers tied to the mortgage, the car, and other bills she had never once asked about because she never imagined I was the one covering them. She stared so long, the store music looped into the same song twice. "Why didn't they tell us?" she finally asked. That was the first honest question anyone in my family had asked me in years. Because it was easier to make me look like a loser than admit I was the one paying for their life, I said. I told her to go home, look around that house, and think hard about who had actually been keeping it standing. She didn't follow me to the checkout. Later that night, my mother called screaming that I had no right to share private financial arrangements with my siblings, which told me everything. The money had been private. My humiliation at dinner apparently wasn't. Christmas week came in like a storm, aimed straight at my phone. Emails from my mother about forgiveness. Texts from my father about pressure and stress, and how he hadn't meant what he said, followed immediately by reminders that they needed me right now. Jason showed up outside my office again on December 26th, pacing on the sidewalk and trying to get security to let him through because I was his sister. They still refused. Inside, I sat at my desk with my headset on, processing claims while my chest felt tight and my inbox filled with family emergency messages that all meant the same thing. Please go back to being useful. That was the week Monica Reed slid a travel mug of coffee onto my desk and asked how I was really doing. I told her more than I planned to, not everything, but enough that she understood this wasn't one bad dinner. It was years of being drained and insulted by the same people. She listened without interrupting, then asked me one question I couldn't shake. If they weren't related to you, would you tolerate any of this? When I said no, she nodded like that was the only answer that mattered, and forwarded me a listing for a fully remote operations job at a software company out west. Over the next few days, while my family kept sending messages about bills, shame, and ruined holidays, I rewrote my resume on my lunch breaks and interviewed from the little desk in my hotel room, with takeout menus stacked under my laptop. Outside, the week before Christmas kept moving like normal. Inside, my life felt like it had cracked open just enough to let air in. On Christmas Eve, Paula called to say she was ashamed of me and that I'd wasted my potential answering phones in a cubicle. I told her calmly that in 6 years, I had sent over $70,000 into my parents' house and my brother's car. And there was a long silence on the line that sounded a lot like someone finally running out of easy things to say. Later that night, with coloured holiday lights from the parking lot leaking through the hotel curtains, a new email hit my inbox. The subject line was one word: offer. I opened the email 3 times before I let myself believe it was real. The offer was from a software company based out west, fully remote, better benefits, and a salary that made my throat tighten when I saw it. $72,000 a year. I sat there on the edge of that stiff hotel chair with my work laptop on one side and a half-eaten takeout salad on the other, staring at a number that felt less like money and more like oxygen. For years, every decision I made had been shaped around what my family might need next. Could I move somewhere better? Not if Mum and Dad were short on the mortgage. Could I build a real emergency fund? Not if Jason was behind on the SUV again. Could I take a vacation, sign a nicer lease, replace my dying mattress? Buy anything without first calculating who might call needing help by Friday? The answer had always been no. Even the little life I had built for myself had been designed around leaving room for their chaos. So when I saw that offer, what hit me first wasn't excitement. It was grief for how long I had accepted crumbs and called it adulthood. I signed the paperwork the next morning before I could talk myself out of it. Then I spent my lunch break looking at apartments in cities far enough away that nobody in my family could decide to drop by when they weren't getting what they wanted. I didn't want another place down the street, or even a few towns over. I wanted distance that meant something, the kind that turned a dramatic drive-by into a flight, a hotel, a plan. Effort my family would never make unless money was involved. That same afternoon, Jason called from a number I didn't know, and I answered before I thought better of it. He skipped hello and went straight into that tight, angry voice people use when they think urgency should count as authority. "This has gone far enough," he said. "Mum and Dad need to know what your plan is, because the house is hanging by a thread." I asked him what exactly he thought my plan should be. He exhaled hard and said the quiet part out loud without even realizing it. "Just go back to how things were until they get on their feet." I actually laughed at that, which made him even angrier. Go back to how things were. As if how things were had been some stable, fair arrangement, instead of me quietly bleeding money into a house where they toasted my failure over dessert. I told him I had accepted a new job and I'd be moving before the end of the month. He demanded to know where, said they deserved at least that much, and I said no one in that family had earned access to me just because we shared a last name. He called me heartless. I asked him if holding my overdraft up at dinner had been loving. For once, he didn't have a smart answer ready. My mother made her last real attempt the next day. She called 3 times, then sent a text saying she was done begging and that if I didn't call her back that afternoon, I was no longer her daughter. I read it twice, mostly because I was surprised by how little it hurt. Maybe because she had already been saying the same thing in different language for years. Every time she treated my labour like an obligation and my feelings like an inconvenience, the message had been clear. I was family when I paid. I was a problem when I didn't. My father followed with his own version of regret, which mostly sounded like pressure in nicer packaging. He said he had been under stress, that the wine had gotten the better of him, that losing the house would break him. Not once did he ask what any of it had done to me. Not once did he mention the years I'd gone without so they could keep pretending they were doing fine. He wanted relief, not accountability. He wanted access, not repair. So I blocked them. All of them. My parents, Jason, Kelsey, Paula, my cousin. Every number, every social account, every email address I knew about. I set up filters for the ones that slipped through and moved the whole mess into a folder I named Evidence, because I already knew how this story would get told once I stopped participating. I'd be cold, ungrateful, unstable. The bitter daughter who ruined Christmas over one joke. People like my parents never call it exploitation when the exploited person finally leaves. They call it betrayal. The week I packed felt strangely calm, almost unreal. I wrapped dishes I'd bought myself, folded work clothes into plastic bins, and signed a lease on a modest one-bedroom in a sun-baked city where nobody knew my family, my history, or the version of me they had spent years keeping alive. On the morning I drove out, my car was packed so tightly I could barely see out the back window. I turned my phone off before I hit the highway, and for the first time in years, silence didn't feel lonely. It felt expensive, private, and completely mine. 2 months later, standing in my new apartment with the blinds half open against a white, blazing afternoon, I finally got the update I knew was coming. A cousin I hadn't blocked yet sent me a short message saying my parents' house had been listed for auction. No drama, no long speech, just that one sentence like even she understood there wasn't much left to say. By then, the missed payments, the late fees, and the lies had all piled up too high to pretend it was a temporary rough patch. The bank moved faster than my parents ever expected, and once the house hit the auction site, the whole performance they had spent years maintaining started collapsing in public. The house sold for less than they owed. My parents didn't walk away with some neat downsizing story or a little nest egg to soften the landing. They walked away with damaged credit, a rental they didn't want, and the kind of forced humility people like them spend their whole lives trying to avoid. Jason's repossession had already wrecked his score, so finding a decent place on his own turned into a mess of extra deposits and rejections. Kelsey burned through more of her own savings than she should have, trying to keep everybody calm and covered before finally realising what I had already figured out. There is no stable future built on feeding chaos just because the chaos shares your last name. What got back to me in pieces over the next few weeks was almost boring in how predictable it was. My mother sold off the things she used to post online, like proof they were doing well, handbags, furniture, little status symbols that had mattered so much when she thought appearances could outrun math. My father blamed the market, the banks, the timing, my attitude, pretty much everything except the years of spending and pride that put them there. Paula got a lot quieter once enough people learned I'd been covering the mortgage for years while being called a disappointment to my face. It turns out family gossip gets less fun when the missing context makes the wrong people look cruel. And me? My life got smaller in the best possible way. Smaller apartment, smaller circle, smaller number of people with access to my time and peace. But for the first time, my life also felt honest. My paycheck landed in my account and stayed there. I bought groceries without doing mental subtraction for someone else's emergency. I furnished my apartment slowly, one useful thing at a time, and every object in that place felt like evidence that I existed as a person, not just a backup plan. At night, when my phone lit up, it wasn't dread anymore. Most of the time, it was nothing urgent at all, just Monica sending me a meme, a co-worker asking a normal question, the quiet kind of contact that doesn't leave damage behind. I used to think peace would feel dramatic when it finally arrived. I thought it would feel like victory, or revenge, or some huge emotional release where I'd cry in relief and know instantly that I had done the right thing. But that isn't what it felt like. It felt like making coffee in the morning without checking my bank balance first. It felt like sitting on my own couch at the end of the day and realising nobody could humiliate me in public and still expect direct deposit in private. It felt like not having to explain why basic respect was a requirement instead of a bonus. Sometimes I still think about that birthday dinner. The fake candlelight, the tiramisu I never touched, my father smiling into his glass while he called me the family's biggest disappointment. For a long time, I replayed that moment like it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Now I see it differently. It was the first honest moment they had given me in years. They told me exactly what they thought of me when they believed I would keep paying anyway. And once I knew that, I was finally free to decide what I thought of them. What I owe them now is nothing. Not because I'm cruel, not because I'm bitter, and not because I wanted them to lose everything. I owe them nothing because love that only exists when you are useful is not love. It's dependence dressed up as family. They called me a disappointment when I was the one quietly carrying them, and the second I stopped, their whole world tipped over. That doesn't make me powerful. It makes the truth obvious. The person they mocked was the person holding the roof up, and when she finally stepped away, they were left standing under the weight of their own choices. If this story meant something to you, like the video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more stories like this. I really want to hear your take on this one. At what point do you think Natalie should have cut them off? Do you think she did the right thing by exposing the financial truth to Kelsey? Or should she have stayed silent? And if your own family treated you with that kind of public disrespect while depending on you in private, would you ever let them back in?